Hello, everyone. This is Dr. Stringer. Welcome to this class on drugs and crime. I will be leading the discussion, so to speak, through these recordings and um, email and announcements and all that good stuff. This is actually my favorite class to teach, and I first developed it as a special topics course and students have really liked it, and I really like to teach it. My research is very much in this area, so I'm kind of the drug expert, so to speak, in the department. So if any of you are interested in this sort of stuff, please let me know because I can bore you to death and give you all sorts of details about pretty much any of the topics that we're going to talk about in this class. Some of you might have taken the social 4200 course on drugs, alcohol, and society. And that's perfectly fine. And this course is going to have some overlap with that course to some extent, but you're also going to have some new information too. And I'm kind of the expert on all of this kind of stuff, so I'll add my little tidbits of information in there as well, so that you'll get to learn a little bit of new stuff. So. Uh, One thing I like to say when I first get started with teaching the course is that if you need to get a hold of me, please email me at my email address. I do not check the D2L messages very regularly, and it's kind of a challenge to use those and stuff. And so, if you need to get a hold of me, please just email me. That is the best way to get a hold of me. If you send me a D2L message, I might reply to it a couple of weeks later when I see it, but you're much better off at using email. And so I like to tell that to students. If you haven't looked over the syllabus, please do that and get to know what you're in store for this course. This lecture is going to be pretty short, and it's just going to be kind of a basic overview of a few things and kind of an introduction to the topic and then telling you all kind of what we're going to cover for the next few weeks. So that'll help you to get a little bit of more information as to where the class is going to go and what we're going to talk about in the coming weeks. If you have any questions, I normally in class I ask if anyone has any questions, but since this is on the online course, you'll have to email me your questions. But please feel free to do so if you have any questions about anything as the class goes on. Chances are, if you have the question, someone else probably does too, and I'll probably send an announcement out to everybody. So that's basically what I'm going to get into for today, is to get into kind of the introduction to the course. So, with no further ado, hopefully you've already read chapter one of your textbook, which is this book right here. So hopefully you have been able to get this. If you did not get it, please do so as soon as you can, as you'll need to read along because I will cover most of the stuff from the book, but obviously I can't get every single little detail that's in there into a lecture, and sometimes there will be other things that you might want to know that you might find interesting in there. This is, like I said, one of my favorite classes to teach, and it's a very interesting topic, I think. It's not like taking research methods or something like that, which I teach as well, and I enjoy teaching probably more than you all enjoy taking that. But anyway, so without any further ado, I'm just going to get right into this and stop talking so much about the course and start getting into a little bit of the content. So, from looking at drug policy over the past 100 years or so, there are three main themes that we're going to kind of talk about throughout the course. And these apply to the history of how things have been going, and we might even look at that when we're talking about, well, what should our policy be like moving forward? What are the most effective things and stuff like that? So, looking at this, the main first one is that changes in drug policy tend to be triggered by particular drugs at particular times. These tend, if you look at that, you have the 1930s with marijuana, then LSD in the 60s, crack cocaine you've probably heard about in the 80s, and that was kind of the beginning of the war on drugs, so to speak. Meth in the 90s. I don't think your book talks about it, but currently we've got the whole issue going on with fentanyl, right? Which actually it is actually a much more legitimate uh, concern than all of these other ones that we've seen in the past, because we're actually seeing people legitimately die, right? In the past, there's been a lot of argument, and I tend to agree with it, that there was it was kind of what we call the social construction of a problem. And by social construction, I mean that it's kind of really constructed falsely in society. Like, take for example, the this idea of marijuana, the big crisis over marijuana in the 30s, was really based upon this idea that people were going to kill people with an axe and murder their families and do all this crazy stuff if they smoked marijuana. And this was actually believed by people in the 1930s. Nowadays, if someone tried to tell you that you were going to go murder your family if you smoked marijuana, you'd probably think that they're crazy, right? But this was actually believed in the 30s. And so there have been other similar things like the crack cocaine epidemic. You could talk about prohibition, how that went all, pretty crazy. And, we, there's been the drunk driving movement in the 80s. That kind of went a little bit more. It had some legitimacy to it, right? Because people do, have injuries and deaths from drunk driving, but that still got a little bit out of hand into what's kind of considered to be a moral panic. So if you look at the ideas of a drug, there's two different, definitions. I put it as a slash there. There's kind of a moral panic, which is one thing, and then some people talk about drug panics as well. So drug panics are kind of any kind of panic in society that is involving drugs, right? So right now we're having a drug panic over fentanyl. Um, Moral panic is tends to be when the panic is magnified more than the actual problem really is, right? And that really gets at that idea of social construction that I was trying to talk about. That the problem is really just exacerbated beyond what the legitimate situation is. Think, for example, for the marijuana panic. Sure, was there people smoking marijuana in the 30s? I bet there was. Was it a real crisis that people were going to kill people with an axe? I highly doubt it. Um, to this day, there's still no record of anyone ever overdosing from marijuana, and I doubt that anybody's really killed anything other than a box of Twinkies after getting stoned. But anyway, um, and a lot of these things tend to revolve around scapegoating various segments of society. So in the 30s, there was, a lot of belief that African Americans, black people, would be smoking marijuana. There was the issues with the Chinese opium dens, and that led to the kind of heroin crisis in the I believe that was the 50s and 60s. Uh, and you saw the crack cocaine epidemic in the 80s, and that was mainly related to African American or black people who lived in urban areas and smoked crack. And nobody really made that into, or should have made that into a big thing, because people weren't dying from smoking crack all over the place as much as it was made up to be. And so when you see people, if you see white people who are using drugs, then I don't know that that has ever really been used to create a moral panic. Now we see something interesting with the fentanyl issue, though, that now more white people are dying from this, and now we're switching to more of a therapeutic or a public health approach, because it's another segment of society that's being plagued by this, not the marginalized groups. And so, long story short is, there's been a lot of inequality in both the enforcement of drug policies and the creation of the drug policies themselves. That I think Michelle Alexander wrote a great book that you all should check out if you like, and talking about how drug policies are often just used to control people who are minorities, and that's certainly not right. Right? And so check out that if you're interested. Let me know, and I'll send you the citation information. Um, and to get back at what I was just talking about, this kind of idea of the punitive approach to the public health approach to dealing with drug abuse. Over time, there's been kind of the tension between these two things, and it still hasn't even been resolved because drug use is really, or drug addiction especially, is kind of an illness, right? And so there should be, at least to some extent, some sort of a public health or medical response to that, right? But on the other side of the coin, there are people who say that, well, people are addicts or people use drugs, and that's their own fault, so they should be punished for that. Um, I don't particularly think that's the best approach. I think maybe that could work for people who are drug traffickers and maybe even drug dealers. But people who have a health problem probably need some sort of a health solution. That would be my opinion on that. And so there's been some kind of tension between those two approaches over the years. It has kind of gone back and forth as well. Before the 1980s, you think about the 60s and 70s, there was especially in the 70s, there was much more of a public health approach to drugs. And then in the 80s, it went back to being way more punitive again. And it's kind of ebbed and flowed a little bit over time. And like I said, right now, we've gone back to more of a public health approach that we're seeing now versus in the 1980s when it was very punitive. Um, so that's one thing that kind of ebbs and flows over time as well. So anyway, uh, looking at kind of the history of drug use, a lot of people don't know, especially in the modern era, but uh, you know, for the most of history, a lot of drugs have been legal. Uh, And so most drugs, at least in the United States, were legal up until the late 19th and early 20th century. The Harrison Narcotics Act was passed in 1914, and the Marijuana Tax Act in 1937. And these were the two biggest federal acts criminalizing drugs in the United States. Before these, there was state, legislation here and there to criminalize drugs, um, and those, were occurring throughout. Interestingly, you'll notice that both of these acts, the Harrison and the Marijuana Act, were both tax acts. For those of you that are interested in constitutional law, uh, you'll note that around this time, the federal government didn't have a lot of power to police things that involved crime. Those powers tended to go to the states because it wasn't a power given to the federal government by the Constitution. And so the states were supposed to police themselves. And that's why you didn't see a lot of federal drug crimes. Now, what they did in order to circumvent that in, is they passed these tax acts because the Supreme Court had said that they did have the power to tax people. And so then what they did, since they didn't have the power to police people and declare these drugs to be illegal, they said, well, we're going to create a law that taxes things. And essentially what happened was they wrote this law that you would have to require a tax stamp in order to possess these drugs. And what happened was is they just didn't give anybody the tax stamp. They didn't sell them or get anybody or allow anyone to pay the tax and then get the stamp to make it legal. And so then, because they had not paid that tax, then it was then a federal crime to possess whatever drug it was, marijuana or cocaine or heroin. Uh, you know, and it was a violation of federal law. Since then, the Commerce Clause has actually been expanded. The interpretation of the Commerce Clause has been expanded to say that the federal government can actually criminalize drugs, and of course, it has been done, which we'll talk about later, because drugs involve money. and drugs often cross state lines. And so, because of the interstate commerce, so a little bit more in the constitutional law, the Commerce Clause of the Constitution allows the federal government to regulate interstate commerce. So essentially, money or things of value that cross state lines. Drugs are one of those, right? And so they were able to say, well, these drugs and the money related to it and other things are crossing state lines. So then, therefore, we should be able to regulate that directly. And then they were allowed to pass legislation directly, such as the Comprehensive Drug Control Act in the 80s and other legislation that we'll get to later on in the class. Anyway, uh, so I like to tell people that because they're always like, why is it called a tax act? Interestingly, also, students often ask me, is the marijuana misspelled here? And no, it's not misspelled. In the early 1900s, that is actually the way they spelled marijuana. They spelled it with an H instead of a J. And I don't know exactly when they changed that, but this was 1937, so at some point since then. I want to say it's right around the 50s off the top of my head, but I'm not positive. Anyway, but as I said, Marijuana Tax Act was 1937, and so up until 1937, it was legal to have marijuana. Now we're seeing that marijuana is starting to get legalized at the state level throughout the country. We've been seeing that since about the 1990s, starting in California for medical uses and things like that. But it is one of the oldest drugs used going back several thousands of years. Um, and one of the other things we're going to talk about in this class is how there's kind of an innate human desire to alter our consciousness. Little kids will start doing it when they're kids, obviously when they're kids, by spinning around to make themselves dizzy and holding their breath and things like that. And if we look at back through history, there's been use of fermented beverages going all the way back to the Stone Age, and fermented honey and mead, and this is going back 10,000 BC, which is a long, long time ago, right? So people have been using drugs at least since 10,000 BC that we know of, but it wasn't until the last less than 100 years, uh, you know, all right, maybe we'll say a little bit over 100 years if you take the Harrison Tax Act of 1914, but the last 100 years that we've decided to criminalize these things. And I think that's something interesting to think about, to put these things into perspective, is that people have been using drugs for 10,000 years, and now we want to criminalize it in the last 100 years, and put lots of people in prison for it. Anyway, that's something to talk about later on in the class too. So anyway, drug use in the United States. Generally, the SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services, reflects how common illegal drug use is in the United States. Um, but this really only gets part of the picture when it includes the high number of persons reporting that they drive under the influence and the gap between those needing treatment and those receiving treatment. So it looks at that kind of stuff too. But there's kind of this unknown part of the data, right? There's some people that do this stuff that aren't getting surveyed, that we don't know about. And it doesn't include the legal drug use. I like to always talk about, my use of coffee. Caffeine is a drug, right? And this gets at kind of the social construction of what is a drug. So caffeine is a drug, tobacco is a drug, aspirin is a drug. At some point in our lives, probably pretty regularly as a matter of fact, most, if not all of us, use drugs, right? So that's something to really wrap your mind around too, right? So I'm using drugs right now because I'm drinking a cup of coffee. I'll have a sip just to prove it to you. Um, so when we think about drug use, we don't really think about that, though, right? We think about, oh, it's a drug user. That's a person that uses cocaine or something like that. Well, what's the real difference? And I'll probably talk about this, try not to be too redundant about it, but you think about what's the difference between smoking marijuana and using alcohol? Well, one's legal and one's not. I mean, there's differences in the way you use it, obviously. Alcohol is actually, in my opinion, way more dangerous than marijuana is, yet one's legal and one's not, and the more dangerous one is the one that's legal. Uh, so these are things that we'll kind of talk about throughout the class and go into more detail on, but just as a little food for thought for now, these are things to kind of think about and kind of things that we'll talk about. So arrest and incarceration for drug-related crime. Um, you know, involvement with illegal drugs certainly does increase the likelihood of involvement with the criminal justice system, and there are a lot of people that commit crimes that use drugs too. So there is a correlation between drug use and crime. Um, One of the things that when I teach research methods, I always drill into students' mind is just because something is correlated doesn't mean that one thing caused the other. There could be some other spurious effect that caused them both. The causation could be reversed. It could be that the crime caused people to use drugs. It could be that the types of people who use drugs also tend to be the types of people that would commit crimes. People who aren't the most law-abiding citizens tend to violate the law in a wide variety of uh, ways. Anyway, um, for those of you that don't know, the United States has the highest incarceration rate in the world. We also tend to arrest more people for drugs than anything else. We also have in the federal prison system, we have more people in there for drugs than we have for anything else. So we're using a lot of resources on these things, and there's a very high course or not course court caseload related to prosecuting drug offenders. So when you think about learning about the criminal justice system and things, drugs are a big part of the criminal justice system. I think that if we legalized all of the drugs, there'd be a whole lot of people out of business or out of a job at least, right? So these are things we're going to talk about too as the course develops and as we come to them, so to speak. So, connections about drug abuse, crime, and the criminal justice system. This is going to be kind of a common theme that we're going to talk about is how does drug abuse and crime interact with the criminal justice system? How do they all interplay? How does this all work out? Why does one thing cause another? Does it really? All these things. So, as I kind of alluded to in the last slide, the drug and crime relationship are related, but the reasons are very complex and very varied. I'm not going to get into all of that right now because we have a whole lecture on that later on in the class. There are substantial costs involved with attempting to control drug use, obviously. This is a lot of our tax dollars going to trying to stop this. Uh, so we'll think about that. It's estimated that in 2007 it was $193 billion. And one of the things that's happening in these states that are legalizing marijuana is that then they're taxing this marijuana. So not only are they saving whatever that state's chunk of this is on the marijuana prosecutions, but they're also making money off of taxing the marijuana. And they're taxing it at a pretty high rate, similar to the way they do alcohol. So instead of spending money, they've got money coming in. Well, it sounds like it might be a halfway good deal to me. Anyway, um, so how the connection between drug use and crime is viewed, it tends to determine the policies, right? If we think that drugs do actually cause crime, if people use drugs, then they're going to commit crimes, then that kind of influences the policies that we're going to create, right? Then we're not going to probably use as much of a public health approach. We tend to use more of a criminal or punitive approach, right? Um, so that's other things to think about as well. Uh, the 21st century tends to be so far adopting the science of the addiction approach or the public health approach. I can certainly, I think I already talked about that, especially when it comes to the fentanyl issue, that we're trying to treat it more of a public health approach. We're, trying to go back and say, well, what can we do? There's one thing going on in Marietta right now is they have a new program called the Assist program, where after someone is essentially brought back to life by giving them the injection to bring them back to life, and the name of it escapes me, for the fentanyl overdose. It'll come back to me. Oh, it's going to drive me crazy now. You'll find that I often will not be able to remember the name. And then, essentially, Narcan. There we go. I've lost it for a second. So after someone is given Narcan and essentially brought back to life from the overdose, then the next day, this team of the assist team will go and visit with that person and explain to them what happened and attempt to get them to go to a drug rehabilitation program. A lot of times they'll go to the extension, which is over here in downtown Marietta. I'm actually on the board over there, and we're actually doing some new stuff to go and start bringing drug treatment into the Cobb County Jail. So that's an interesting thing, but I won't get into all of that right now. But anyway, so that's one way that the police are kind of taking more of a punitive, or not punitive, but a public health approach to say, hey, let's see if we can get this person some help from these, public health people, rather than just say, okay, well, we're going to put you in jail, uh, because that tends to not really work. So, looking at our goals for this class, our main goal is to kind of provide you with a comprehensive analysis of these interrelationships between the drug abuse and the crime correlation. We're also going to look at how drug offenses are policed. We're going to look at how they play out in the court system, the sentencing of them, as well as corrections, the different ways that we can try to essentially rehabilitate drug offenders once they're in the criminal justice system. We'll talk about drug courts. We'll talk about different models like that. We'll talk about what they do in Amsterdam. We'll talk about kind of the punitive approach and whether that's really working for us or not. Um, and so I'll just kind of overview the next couple of chapters just to give you an idea of what we're going to be talking about. Chapter 2, we look at how drugs are categorized based on the neurochemical effects, and then address some physiological and behavioral effects. We'll talk about kind of the types of drugs that there are, things like that. Chapter 3 explores some different theories related to drug abuse, addiction, disease. There's the biological, psychological, sociological theories. And then we'll look at, in chapter 4, the theories concerning the link between drug use and crime. Do drugs really cause people to commit crime, or is perhaps it a little bit more nuanced than that? Is it more complicated? I can tell you right now, it is pretty complicated. Um, anyway, and the connection doesn't mean that the drug causes the crime. Uh, Again, correlation doesn't equal causation. So, in chapter 5, we'll look at the history of criminalization of drugs. As I mentioned earlier, it kind of started in 1914 with the Harrison Act. Then we had the Marijuana Act, or Marijuana Tax Act, in 1937. Some other big ones were the Comprehensive Controlled Substances Act in 1970, and the Anti-Drug Abuse Acts of 86 and 88. We'll talk more about those when we talk about chapter 5. Um, Chapters 6 through 8 are really going to talk about policing drug use, how drug offenders are handled in the courts, and of the prosecution and adjudication and sentencing of drug offenders. And then, like I said, we're going to talk about corrections and how the different methods of putting uh, drug offenders through corrections, through rehabilitative methods, and things like that. Um, so that'll be those chapters. When we get up to chapter 9, we're going to talk about kind of our assessment of the war on drugs. Um, do we think that what we're doing is working? What could we do better? Things like that. What are other countries doing that maybe we could take some notes from? Things like that. So these are kind of some high points, right? Uh, Chapter 10 is going to look at some trends for the 21st century. What are we doing? Where are we going to go in the future, right? Um, Move away from the punitive to the therapeutic model. I think that's a great idea. and we've been doing that, and hopefully that will keep up, barring any big moral panic. I think that things will probably continue on that direction at least for a little while. So the conclusion from that is rethinking the drug problem with a focus on retraining and education or educating criminal justice employees about drug use and treatment. Um, you know, I think that one of the things that hopefully some of you will be able to take away from this class as you move into your careers and things is that, we really need to treat drug users as people and realize that they have, an addiction. It's a problem. There's a Supreme Court case in Robinson versus the U.S. Where essentially a state had criminalized addiction, and the judge said you can't make a medical condition a crime. To do so is no different than to criminalize someone for having a cold. And so you can't make it a crime for something that someone has no control over. They have no control over whether they have a crime or have a cold or not. And if you look on the books, because of that decision, there is no actual crime of being a drug addict. Uh, what is a crime, though, is being in possession of drugs, or selling drugs, or trafficking drugs, things like that. Those things are a crime because there's no Supreme Court opinion that says that you can't criminalize possessing the drugs. So there's that. So that's where we'll kind of stop things for today. I ended up talking for longer than I anticipated, but you'll probably find that that will be common because I have a lot to say about these things. So anyway, we'll talk next week about psychoactive drugs and drug abuse, and hopefully get into some of that. I look forward to having you all in the class, and I hope that you'll have a good semester. And of course, please, feel free to email me or talk to me if you have any questions. And with that, I will sign off and talk to you next time. Thanks.